Informed Choice Radio, episode 357 with Saifedean Ammous, author of The Bitcoin Standard.
Live from Sundial House Studios, this is Informed Choice Radio. Want to make the most of your money and your life? You've come to the right place. Now, here's your host, Martin Bamford.
Hello and welcome back to Informed Choice Radio. I'm Martin Bamford. When a pseudonymous programmer introduced a new electronic cash system that's fully peer-to-peer with no trusted third party to a small online mailing list back in 2008, very few people paid any attention. 10 years later, and against all odds, this upstart, autonomous, decentralized software offers an unstoppable and globally accessible hard money alternative to modern central banks. In this episode, I'm joined by the economist Dr. Saifedean Ammous. In his book, The Bitcoin Standard, he analyses this historical context to the rise of Bitcoin, the economic properties that have allowed it to grow so quickly, and its likely economical, political, and social implications. While Bitcoin is a new invention of the digital age, the problem it purports to solve is as old as human history itself, transferring value across time and space. Is Bitcoin mining a waste of energy? Is Bitcoin just for criminals? Who controls Bitcoin, and can they change it if they please? There are so many questions surrounding Bitcoin, crypto assets, and the blockchain right now. In this episode, we seek some of the answers. Please do take a moment to say thank you to Saifedean on Twitter and wish him every success with his book. You can find him at Saifedean, that's Saifedean. Here's my conversation with Saifedean Ammous, author of The Bitcoin Standard, in episode 357 of Informed Choice Radio. Well, welcome back to Informed Choice Radio. I'm delighted to welcome today Saifedean Ammous. We're going to talk about The Bitcoin Standard, your new book. But perhaps, Saif, you could start by just introducing yourself and telling us a bit about your background.
Thank you so much for having me, Martin. It's a pleasure to be on your podcast. I'm a university professor. I teach economics at the Lebanese American University in Beirut, Lebanon. And I have been interested in Bitcoin for about 7 years or so now. I've been researching it and reading it, and after a few years of being skeptical about its prospects of working, I started to come around to the idea that this might be a little bit more than just a game played online between various fringe groups, and that this might actually be an important technological innovation in the history of money and in history of the technologies that we as humans have used as money. And so I started writing and researching that more closely, and then in 2016 I started writing a book about it, which was published in early 2018, called The Bitcoin Standard, and it discusses how I see the importance of Bitcoin, the significance of Bitcoin, and the economic reasons for why it has survived so long, and what this means for the future and how long it can go on.
What was the turning point for you that took you from being skeptical about the prospects of Bitcoin working to, I guess, a believer in Bitcoin? What was it that changed your mind?
I think the two main things, I try and always be an open-minded person. And so when I have a perspective on things, I try and keep in mind, what would it take for me to change my mind on this? So in the case of Bitcoin, the first thing was that I thought, this will never generate serious holding demand amongst people to want to hold it long enough that its price will rise enough so that it can become a serious financial asset that a lot of people around the world hold with a serious amount of liquidity. And so watching the price go from under $1 to $1 over $100 was a bit of a wake-up call, because the price just continued to go up, and so that was clearly disproving my initial hypothesis. Secondly, and this was really, I think, the main turning point, it was after the Silk Road website was taken down in early March. And it's a horrible story, how this miscarriage of justice was undertaken, and how the agents that were in charge of the case fabricated evidence in order to steal the Bitcoins themselves. And we just saw this week that Ross Ulbricht, the man indicted with this, the charges for murder were dropped. The idea that he was conspiring for murder was something that the press lapped up, being given by the FBI agents, and stupid rags like Wired ran with it with extensive sensationalized details about how he tried to order hits and so on. And yet it was not brought up as part of his indictment, for which he went to jail. And the indictment about it was dropped just last week. So the whole thing was clearly fabricated. If the guy had been part of a murder conspiracy, he'd at least have been charged with it. But there was no charge for it, and he's only serving time for setting up a website, which is an astonishing injustice. But in any case, putting aside these moral considerations, for me the interesting thing was that was exactly that sort of scenario that I thought would kill Bitcoin. I thought, as it starts growing, somebody will use it, and then as more and more people will use it, and then the FBI or the CIA or somebody will come arrest someone for taking part in Bitcoin, and it might even be trumped up charges about drugs or terrorism or child pornography or whatever. And the result of it is that one or two prominent young people, just regular wholesome CEOs of companies, or people you wouldn't really associate with crime, are going to be thrown into jail as a way to just scare people away from this thing. And so when it happened with Silk Road, my initial reaction was, yep, this is it. This is the end of the Bitcoin experiment. That's how it's going to fall apart. And yet we saw in the weeks after that, Bitcoin did not fall apart, and the value of Bitcoin kept on rising. And perhaps more interesting, the number of transactions carried out on the network continued largely unaffected by the collapse of the Silk Road. And so that made me realize that, this idea that Bitcoin is just a tool that's going to be online for criminals, and that once we start catching those criminals and putting them in jail, the whole thing falls apart, that clearly didn't hold. And that was really, I think, this turning point at which I started taking it seriously.
What is Bitcoin, in the sense that you mentioned there it being a store of value, sort of the holding demand for it? Is it a way of transferring value, or is it an asset? Is it an investment asset in your mind?
All of the above, basically. The key thing is that new technological innovations can't really be easily boxed into categories that were developed before they were invented. And so right now, Bitcoin can be called a commodity, it can be called an investment, it can be called a currency, it can be called money. You have to understand people have different definitions for these terms. There's, these economic terms, economics is not an exact technical science where these words have uncontroversial definitions, like in physics, or in chemistry, the definition for what constitutes a chemical or an element. It's pretty clear, testable in a lab, and there's no disagreement about what is chlorine, for instance. And so either something is chlorine or it isn't. But in economics, it's not like that. There are many different schools of thought that have different definitions for what's a commodity, what's an investment, what's money, and so on. So it's not very easy to get into those things. And in my book, I try and avoid this discussion because I just don't think it's a very useful thing to just spend our time trying to box Bitcoin into categories that existed before it was around. And I think it's more valuable to just try and explain Bitcoin for what it is. And then, with time, its properties will develop in the way that suit it better as the market sees. And people will be able to develop their own understanding, and maybe we'll come up with new terms to explain what it really is. But if I were to say what it is just, I would say at a simple level, on a basic realistic description, Bitcoin is software, and that's the important thing to keep in mind. Bitcoin is a distributed software that works over a network of distributed computers with no single point of failure, no single computer being critical to the operation of the network. And this software allows you to run a payments network with its own hard money. That's really what Bitcoin is. So it's a, you have this payment network that allows you to send money on the network, but you can't send dollars or pounds or any other currency or gold. You can only send the native token of the network itself. This is really how I like to explain Bitcoin, and I think it deliberately avoids all of the controversial definitions, because it's just it's I think a functional definition. And then the key point for me is that it's with its own native network, that the native network's token is hard money. It's hard to create this money, and this is the root of my fascination with Bitcoin. It is the hardest form of money that we've ever invented.
What are the big flaws in our current monetary system that Bitcoin seeks to fix?
I would say there are two, and they're quite related. The first one is the fact that everything currently is centralized, and that makes the monetary system very easy to co-opt and control by governments, which then turns money from the measure of value of a market economy, which rewards people based on being productive, turns it from that into essentially a loyalty program or brownie points for government. And so in a society in which government controls the banking system and the central bank and the currency, you cannot make money unless your government is happy with you. And so it becomes like a brownie point scheme. And this is an extremely dangerous, destructive thing, because people's incentive goes away from producing things of value to others and is changed into producing into loyalty for government. And that then creates the incentive for people to do things behind their government's back, criminal, illicit activities, and so on. I think that entire thing needs to just be ripped out. This idea that government controls money, I find it to be as abhorrent as the notion of government controlling speech. Because at the end of the day, money is information, and speech is information. And so, for me, the idea that we have a central bank that controls all financial flows in a society outside of small cash payments is exactly as ridiculous and unjust as if we had a ministry of truth that controls everything that anybody can say. Imagine everything that we have to say in this podcast has to go to a ministry of truth somewhere in England, where some guy sits down and listens to it and makes sure that it is approved. It doesn't matter who's in charge of that kind of system. It doesn't matter if your political party or mine wins this election, and then we get to appoint the kind of person who's going to be sitting there and listening to everyone's conversation. This is a far more dangerous thing to have than the alternative of people saying dangerous things, because the way a free society works is that everybody says what they want, and people bear the consequences of their actions and their words. And so, that allows everybody to say what they want. And even though some people will say wrong things, there are newspapers that carry false articles and there are people who lie. I'd much rather live in a society in which that happens, because a free society will punish those people who do those bad things, than live in a society in which people, somehow we're being sold the delusion that we're going to be not experiencing any lies, because we're giving some person the power to decide who gets to say what. That power for one person to be able to decide who gets to say what is far more dangerous than anything that any individual liar could communicate. And so I think the same is true in terms of money. The notion that we need to control money and control banking and central banking in order to stop crime and terrorism and all of that stuff, I think is a ridiculous it's ridiculous justification. Fundamentally, what it comes down to is government control, government finances, government strengthening its grip on people's lives, because that's what governments everywhere want to do. And also just the monopolies that governments prop up benefit from these restrictions, because they are effectively barriers to entry for others into entering this market. And so Bitcoin, so this is the first one, the idea of a centralized authority in charge of financial transfers and in charge of the monetary unit. And secondly, which is a result of that, the fact that we have governments in charge of money means that we have easy money, means that the money that pretty much any country in the world uses today is, by historical standard, easy money, meaning that it's easy to increase the supply of that kind of money. And that's really the main problem for me. That's what got me interested in Bitcoin in the first place. This notion that, I've always been interested in the topic of easy money versus hard money, the impacts they have on the economy. And this is, and Bitcoin comes along as just an astonishingly interesting experiment in bringing back hard money, which is something we haven't had in many decades. Money that's hard to make and that nobody can print at ease, and money whose cost of production is largely equal or roughly equal to the cost of buying it on the market. That's, for me, the most astonishing and important facet of Bitcoin. It's why I've been drawn into Bitcoin and really interested in it for several years, because that's something that I was really interested in even before I heard about Bitcoin.
Well, it might be worth going into a bit more detail on that easy money versus hard money aspects of it, because, of course, Bitcoin, it's becoming progressively harder to mine new Bitcoin, as far as I understand. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's because of the complexity of the sort of cryptography that you have to do?
Not exactly the complexity of the cryptography. It's because of the difficulty of the mining. It's not exactly the cryptography that increases the cost. The cryptography is always going to be hard to crack, but the reason that the way that you can make new Bitcoins is that you have to solve something called the proof of work. And this proof of work is, you can think about it as dumb hard labor for computers, that they just need to keep guessing a number in order to try and find the correct answer to a puzzle. And so that puzzle is meant to be solved once every 10 minutes. Thanks to the difficulty adjustment, the more that people enter into this puzzle contest, into this guessing contest, the more difficult it becomes to ensure that it can only be solved every 10 minutes. And so that ensures that the supply only increases by the predetermined rate of however many Bitcoins every 10 minutes. And so for those of you who don't know, the way that it works is that it was 50 Bitcoin per 10 minutes initially. And then after the first 4 years, it dropped to 25 Bitcoins per 10 minutes. And then after the next 4 years, it's 6.25. And every 4 years, it'll drop by half until about the year 2140 or so, when that's when the block reward disappears, it goes to zero.
Putting your sort of crystal ball on the table and look into the future, how do you see Bitcoin playing a role in the future of our monetary systems? Will it replace existing fiat currencies, or do you think it's going to just run alongside them?
It hasn't replaced them yet, so it's a little premature to sing the praises of their deaths and to celebrate the death of fiat money, much as we would enjoy it, particularly as Bitcoiners. But I think, and it's very hazardous to make guesses about the future, particularly when it comes to technology. And my book, it's I think I may have said that during the introduction, but it doesn't really make predictions. I wasn't really being accurate. It doesn't really make a lot of predictions about the future. It just puts things out there and tells you what you think. What the economic properties they are, and then you can draw your own conclusions. But the way that I see it is the decentralization aspect, the fact that nobody is in charge of Bitcoin settlement, makes it such that it's possible for Bitcoin to have the equivalent of a central banking system with thousands of central banks, rather than the current international system, which has effectively one central bank. I mean, yes, all countries are happy about having their own currency and their own central bank, but really, your central bank is just a branch of the US central bank. When the central bank of any country wants to send money to any other country, it goes through the US Federal Reserve, and every country out there has dollars in its reserves, pretty much every country. So, the current system is not decentralized to the level of hundreds of central banks. It's centralized to one central bank. And that's just the nature of banking settlement with assets like gold that are not easy to move around, makes it such that it's always going to tend towards centralization. There will always be economies of scale and benefits from centralization. And so the situation of the current central banking system is heavily dependent on centralization, whereas Bitcoin could be far more decentralized with thousands of units acting like central banks. And so thousands of units being able to carry out final settlement of transactions across the world, which currently only one central bank can do. So if we move towards that system with these thousands of banks, I think the advantage, because of Bitcoin, people think of the transaction costs and the transaction fees of Bitcoin as being too high, because they think of them as being competing with your Visa and MasterCard transaction as a consumer payment. But that's really not the case. The way that I see it, Bitcoin transactions are competing against central bank settlement transactions. So if you think about it that way, even at current transaction fees, or at 100 times current transaction fees, a Bitcoin transaction is a bargain. There are no other cheaper ways of sending money halfway across the world that can even compete with Bitcoin. And by money, I mean sending final transfer of money. You can make a payment with your credit card to somebody in China, and yeah, they'll get it in a few seconds, but they didn't really get it. What they got is a promise for it, and then your bank and their bank are going to spend the next few weeks settling it, and your central bank and other central banks and so on. So, Bitcoin allows you a way around that. It allows you final settlement available to many thousands of node operators. So I think the benefit from that is going to be immense for anybody who uses it. Number one, just the ability to settle money abroad. And so if you think about it, the subtitle of my book says the Bitcoin standard is the decentralized alternative to central banking. And that's the point really that I'm trying to communicate from my book. Bitcoin is not an alternative to Western Union or PayPal or Visa or MasterCard. It's a decentralized alternative to this system of central banks that we have all around the world. And so what Bitcoin is so the benefits of having this very fast clearance system globally, plus the benefits of it having hard money, are going to mean that people who use it are going to benefit immensely over time. And so how that plays out with government money is something that, we can't make predictions about, because it depends on individual human beings and their actions and what they're going to be doing. And so I'm not entirely sure how governments will react to this. One possibility is that they'll recognize the threat. They'll recognize that, okay, this is just a faster, more efficient way of settling final payments, and they'll start using it. More and more governments will start using Bitcoin as a method to settle their own international payments with other people. The alternative is that they continue to refuse it. They continue to call it a scam. They continue to call it a Ponzi scheme. They continue to hysterically cry about, oh my God, the environmental impact of it, or whatever latest hysteria people are peddling about why Bitcoin is bad. And in this case, they will just be like newspapers that refuse to embrace the internet. Eventually, more and more people are going to move online, because it's far more convenient way of getting your news, of just clicking something, getting it, reading it, and then moving on, rather than having to carry around a large piece of stinky paper that leaves spots on your fingers. So the way that I see it is that it's a more advanced technology for performing the functions of money, because it allows much more final settlement around the world in under 1 hour. You send money from here to China, and it clears finally in under 1 hour, which nothing else allows us to do. Imagine if you wanted to send gold, or imagine the central banks between them, how long it takes them to settle. It's nothing like 1 hour with Bitcoin. On the other hand, it's hard money. The supply can't be increased. And so that just means that people who put their wealth in it eventually, over time, will likely witness their wealth appreciate rather than depreciate, which is the case in government money. So the way that I see it, it's a lopsided fight. Bitcoin's economic characteristics make it, it's almost like cheating against all the other ones. Bitcoin is racing downhill while all the others are racing uphill in this race. And so it'll be interesting to see how it'll unfold, although I make no predictions about it.
My final question, and Saif, is as an investor looking at the current price of Bitcoin, how can we see if it's fair value? Do we simply accept that the current price is the current price and that's what Bitcoin is worth? Or some people I know have a view that it could be a bubble at certain levels and that it doesn't really have a true inherent value to it. So how do we value Bitcoin?
So as an economist from the Austrian school, the way that we think about value is that value is always subjective. There's no such a thing as fixed value or intrinsic value. There's no scientific formula for determining what value things have. Value is always dependent upon what people make of it. So there was a time in which oil, for instance, was something that you had to pay people to come and take from your land in order for you to be able to use the land for something productive. So oil had a negative value. Then we found out that we could use this thing to run engines, and then its value became positive. The actual oil itself is exactly the same. The only thing that has changed is how we value it and how we think of it. And this, many of the Bitcoin critics say, well, Bitcoin's value is just dependent on what people think it is. It has no real intrinsic value. And that just, anybody who says that, in my opinion, just doesn't understand what economics is, because everything is like that. Your computer, your entire town, all of the real estate in your town, everything that you can think of, whatever you can think of that is real, or even abstract, if it has value in people's minds, it has value. If it doesn't, then it doesn't. So Bitcoin is no exception like that. If everybody in London tomorrow decided that we don't like London anymore and we don't want to live in London, then everybody leaves London and your real estate in London is worth exactly zero, or if not even less, because you need to get rid of it in one way or the other and maintain it or whatever. So a £10 million apartment in London right now would drop to zero value if everybody decided, for whatever reason, that London is not a place that they wanted to live in. The same is true of Bitcoin. If everybody tomorrow decided Bitcoin is not worth using, the value could drop to zero. So it's an entirely subjective valuation. And in the case of Bitcoin, it's entirely subjective also because there's it's not a financial asset that yields returns. The way that you value bonds or stocks is through the returns that they yield and the risk involved and a few other parameters, and then people come up with a good valuation of what the stock should be. But Bitcoin offers no return. So it's similar to gold in that regard, and it's similar to the dollar or the euro or the pound. It's fundamentally about the dynamics of supply and demand. Now, in all other kinds of currencies and forms of money, the supply is a lot more unpredictable, but the demand is largely more predictable. But with Bitcoin at this stage, the supply is completely predictable, but the demand is entirely unpredictable because nobody knows what the number of people buying Bitcoin today is and how many people are selling. Some TV show in China tomorrow decides to have a special about Bitcoin. That could lead to many millions of people in China deciding to buy Bitcoin, and that will cause the price to rise. Some TV show in Japan going on about how Bitcoin is evil tomorrow and how Bitcoin is bad and it's used for drugs or whatever could be quite effective in getting a lot of Japanese people to stop liking Bitcoin, and so the price will crash. And so, I have to keep repeating this. My book is not an advertisement for Bitcoin, and it's not. It does not tell you to buy Bitcoin. And in fact, I don't think most people should be, reading my book and then just going there and buying Bitcoin. I think if you're interested in it, before even thinking about putting any money into it, the real investment is to try and understand how it works, understand what it means to own a Bitcoin, how you can own it, what you can do with it, and that's really the real investment that you need to make. Now, in terms of buying it, I would recommend just not being exposed to a lot of the volatility in a way that could hurt you. Just keep in mind that this is an instrument that could drop 60, 70, 80, 90%. It has done it before. It could do it again. The important thing about it, the interesting thing about it is that the supply is limited. And so in the long run, you would not expect it to go down for too long. So I would tell people to follow a Nassim Taleb, author of The Black Swan, follow a Nassim Taleb kind of strategy where you're not thinking about the probabilities, but you're thinking about the payoffs. And so don't put in any amount of money that's going to make you lose sleep if it loses 80% of its value tomorrow. Put in the sort of money that you're comfortable with leaving in Bitcoin for several years. And that could be $5, it could be $500. It depends upon you, it depends upon your preferences, it depends upon what other investments and opportunities and expenditures you have. But generally, I think it's a terrible idea to go and, let's say, you want to buy a house next year, so you decide, let me put all of the money into Bitcoin today, so that next year I'll have more money and buy a house. A lot of people have made mistakes like that, and they've not, they did not work out well. So I can't make predictions about what the price is going to look like. I would advise people to not try to do it, and instead just protect yourself from being exposed too much, and only if you are interested in investing in it, only do so very carefully. This is, I don't think Bitcoin is going to just dominate the world economy over the next couple of years. It's going to probably take a longer time. So there's no rush here. There's no point in playing this casino of the high volatility early period, because you could get really hurt. The important thing is to just get into it, know how to use it, understand it, and have something there, something that you don't really risk. And that's, I think, a better way of approaching the question of Bitcoin valuation.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense. So thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today. Before I let you go, how can we connect with you online, and how can we find out more about your book? So
the place where I'm most active is Twitter, usually. My handle is Saifedean, which is my first name, Saifedean. So you can you can see me on Twitter. I also have my website is saifedean.com, and it has links to my academic research and to my blog, where I occasionally post a few articles here and there. And you can buy my book, The Bitcoin Standard, in all good online retailers.
Fab, thank you. We'll make sure we put links in our show notes as well to your Twitter and the website, and also the book, so our listeners can get hold of that. Thank you so much for your time. That's brilliant. A big thank you to Saif for joining me for this episode of Informed Choice Radio. Don't forget to check out his new book. It's called The Bitcoin Standard. It's available now on Amazon. Let me know what you think about the points that we touched on in this episode. You can drop me a line. That's martin@icfp.co.uk. Get in touch on Twitter @MartinBamford, or leave me a voicemail via our website. So go to icradio.co.uk/voicemail. Until next time, I'm Martin Bamford, and this is Informed Choice Radio. And remember, when it comes to your money, the more you know, the faster it can grow.